Buenos días. Estamos muy contentos y contentas de tenerles hoy día aquí en el GAM y darles la bienvenida a este seminario que hemos titulado Desafíos éticos del trabajo participativo con niñeces, el cual surge como una instancia de perfeccionamiento y reflexión desde la alianza establecida entre el Centro de Estudios Interculturales e Indígenas, CIIR, con el programa CECREA del Ministerio de las Artes, Culturas y Patrimonios, y que también cuenta con la colaboración y participación del Instituto Milenio para la Investigación en Violencia y Democracia, VIODEMOS. En primer término, se dirigirá a ustedes, les dirigirá a ustedes unas palabras de bienvenida el señor Pedro Mege, director del Centro de Estudios Interculturales e Indígenas.
Muy buenos días, estimadas autoridades, investigadores, alumnos, público en general. Como director del Centro de Estudios Interculturales e Indígenas CIIR, es un gusto dar algunas palabras al inicio del seminario Desafíos éticos del trabajo participativo con niñez, coorganizado por CECREA, Centro de Creación, con nuestro centro, el CIIR, por supuesto, y VIODEMOS. Para nosotros fue muy impresionante encontrarnos con CECREA, porque somos un centro de investigación de excelencia, se supone, lo que podrán ustedes tal vez discutir. Y haberse topado con estos centros tan sofisticados, con una infraestructura extraordinaria, con la participación casi frenética de los niños, era realmente impresionante. Este seminario tiene como objetivo reflexionar acerca de los dilemas éticos presentes en el trabajo participativo con niñeces, principalmente en contextos interculturales, que es un poco la novedad que creo que va a ser uno de los aportes a este seminario. Es un evento que se ha propuesto convocar a un público amplio y diverso, congregando especialistas del mundo académico, público y del tercer sector. Así nos honra contar con la participación académica de Afua Twun-Danso Imoh de la Universidad de Bristol. Sí, espero haberlo pronunciado bien. All right? Yes? Thank you. Quien a continuación ofrecerá una charla magistral sobre los problemas éticos asociados a la investigación participativa con niños, niñas y jóvenes a partir de su propia investigación, entregando valiosos aportes conceptuales. La charla estará seguida de la mesa redonda Ética, Interculturalidad y Participación en el Trabajo con Niñeces, presidida por la doctora Mariana García Palacios del CONICET, Argentina, en la que profesionales y académicos discutirán sobre las maneras en las que en sus áreas de trabajo abordan la diversidad cultural. Esto es muy interesante porque siempre la diversidad cultural se supone que es una cuestión de sujetos formados, es decir, adultos, pero no. Si no se equivocó nuestro querido amigo Sigmund Freud, parece que la niñez es muy importante al respecto. Quisiera detenerme unos momentos en que este seminario responde a la alianza colaborativa que desde el 19 sostenemos junto a CECREA, que tiene este vínculo al arte, que fue una de las grandes innovaciones de nuestro centro, el haber abierto nuestras mentes al arte como un mecanismo de difusión y de comprensión de los fenómenos interculturales. Esta alianza entonces de investigación, creación artística, prácticas profesionales para estudiantes de la carrera de antropología de la Universidad Católica, coordinada a través del Laboratorio de Antropología y Arqueología Visual, el LAV. Otra de las características de nuestros centros es tener este laboratorio junto con la Escuela de Antropología de lo que llaman ahora antropología sensorial, que no es exclusivamente visual, sino que tiene que ver con toda la posibilidad sensorial de expresión artística, y que los invito a ustedes a que lo conozcan. Creo que es una iniciativa muy interesante. A través de amplísimo marco de acción de trabajo conjunto, entonces, entre el LAB, CECREA, se ha sumado VIODEMOS, ¿no es cierto?, y el CIIR. Además, hemos celebrado, por ejemplo, talleres de etnografía situadas territorialmente. Eso creo que es interesante que lo discutamos, cómo la etnografía, que es esta estrategia y este método tan particular, ¿no?, que inventaron una serie de personajes excéntricos y de moral a veces un poco dudosa, porque claro, se sumergía en el mundo que eran excesivamente distintos. Es un gran instrumento. Y también las residencias artísticas en diversos CECREAs a lo largo de Chile. Si andan cerca de algún CECREA, no duden en visitarlo, son realmente notables. Este seminario entonces obedece a un macizo trabajo cooperativo que esperamos continúe en el futuro, que ha tenido pródigos resultados como lo demuestran los productos que tenemos hasta ahora. Bueno, muchas gracias y que sea un fructífero seminario, no me cabe duda.
Muchas gracias, Pedro. A continuación, se dirige a ustedes el director del Instituto Milenio para la Investigación en Violencia y Democracia, Ángel Aedo.
Gracias, Marjorie, Pedro. Distinguidas colegas, estimados participantes. En nombre del Instituto para el Estudio de la Violencia y la Democracia, me complace darles la más cordial bienvenida a este seminario internacional, un espacio creado para el intercambio de experiencias y saberes sobre las niñeces. Quisiera comenzar agradeciendo a la doctora Afua Twun-Danso Imoh por su generosa presencia entre nosotros. Su viaje a estas tierras lejanas de América del Sur no solo nos honra, sino que también nos brinda una oportunidad única para fortalecer los intercambios y experiencias sur-sur. Esta es una expresión que, si bien se repite con frecuencia en círculos académicos y políticos, aún no se materializa en la medida que deseamos. Es por ello que centros como el CIIR y VIODEMOS celebramos y apoyamos este tipo de iniciativas donde el trabajo en torno a las niñeces toma un lugar central. Sin embargo, no se trata de repetir discursos de autoridad, un poco como recordaba Pedro a la Sigmund Freud. Se trata sino de develar, intuyo, nuestras propias limitaciones, opacidades e imprudencias, con el objetivo de desarrollar una práctica de conocimiento e intervención co-construida con nuestros interlocutores. Estoy seguro que esta jornada será rica en descubrimientos y aprendizajes. Bueno, no me queda más que desearles que esta jornada sea un buen inicio para la cooperación. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Ángel. Finalmente le doy la palabra a Daniel Hermosilla, que es Coordinador Nacional de CECREA.
Hola, buenos días. Bueno, estamos muy contentos de poder haber materializado esta alianza a través de este momento de reflexión, de poder conversar, de poder de alguna manera como dar un espacio de reflexión en torno a las niñeces que como país merecemos, digamos, y que nos hace tanta falta. Para nosotros de CECREA, los niños, las niñas y los jóvenes están al centro de todas las acciones que hacemos. Sin embargo, para ello es fundamental de que podamos generar estas instancias de reflexión con los adultos para poder tener las mejores herramientas para poder acercar cada una de las experiencias que tratamos de que en los CECREAs ocurran de mejor manera. Es por ello de que en esta alianza que ya lleva 3 años con el CIIR nos genera mucha fortaleza en torno a este espacio de intercambios de conocimientos, intercambios de experiencias que permiten un vínculo que en el fondo siento particularmente que está ha costado fortalecer, que es el mundo del Estado con las universidades, ese intercambio de conocimiento que se puede dar ahí, esa fortaleza que se puede crear al poder generar alianzas que sean fructíferas a la hora de poder generar política pública. Es ahí donde nosotros nos situamos, es ahí también donde nosotros tratamos de generar este tipo de instancias y también fortalecer a nuestros equipos, a cada una de las personas que de alguna manera colabora con CECREA, porque CECREA tiene una fuerte mirada, o sea, fuerte valoración de lo que significa la generación de redes y la generación de comunidades de aprendizaje. Porque eso vuelve fuerte al programa, vuelve fuerte a la política pública, vuelve fuerte también la posibilidad de hacer injerencia, de hacer transformaciones en el mundo de la niñez, que es tan importante y fundamental a la hora de poder pensar un país. Así que estamos muy contentos en este momento. Yo la verdad me siento privilegiado también de poder compartir estas palabras con todos los que están acá presentes y muy contento en el fondo de que ustedes hayan venido a participar y que ojalá sea muy enriquecedor para cada uno de ustedes. Eso, gracias.
Bueno, agradecemos las palabras que nos han dirigido y a continuación, siguiendo con nuestro programa, vamos a dar la palabra a la doctora Afua Twun-Danso Imoh, quien presentará su conferencia magistral Problematizando la ética de la investigación en la niñez, una perspectiva relacional. Afua Twun-Danso Imoh es académica de la Universidad de Bristol. Su investigación se centra en las construcciones de la infancia y los derechos de los niños en Ghana y en la problematización del binario norte global versus sur global. Es directora del Centro de Investigación de la Infancia y la Familia. Muchas gracias, doctora Twun-Danso Imoh, y les invitamos ahora a escuchar.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much for inviting me all the way from the UK. Thank you to the Centre for Intercultural Exchange. I'm sorry, I have a cold, so bear with me. The Centre for Intercultural Exchange, VIODEMOS, and CECREA for coming together to organise this. I arrived on Monday, and I have learned so much in the short time I've been here. I didn't know too much about Chile, but through the various events that Gabriela and Marjorie have organised in the university as well as at CECREA, I have learned so much about the issues that researchers working with children or on childhood issues are facing in this context. And I've learned a lot about some of your public policies relating to children's rights. So I'm very excited about going back to Bristol and talking about some of the things that I have learned with my colleagues in Bristol. Today I wanted to talk a bit about problematizing ethics in relation to childhood competence and how that can be understood differently in different contexts, which then has implications for us as researchers and when we're trying to do research with children in different contexts. I have to apologize because I have a tendency to talk very fast, and I'm reminding myself that I need to go slow to help the interpreters and also to help you. But sometimes I will forget. So if I forget, can somebody open their eyes really wide and so I can remind myself to go slow again, okay? So it's really a good time to be thinking about these issues because September will mark 100 years since the Declaration on the Rights of the Child, the Geneva Declaration. And I think that it means that this whole year, 2024, it's a really important time to be reflecting on what we've achieved in relation to children's rights and also to reflect on what we want the next 100 years to look like in relation to children's rights. So I am a historian, originally I'm a historian, so my starting point is always history. And so the way I want to start today is to talk about how I would say that today we now widely recognize that dominant children's rights discourses, which I would say is best reflected by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's basically emerges or has emerged from, sorry, I've forgotten this. This basically says what I want to do, the aim of the lecture today. So I want to basically problematize the notion of childhood competence in research, ethics, governance processes, and consider the implications this has for children's rights. And the starting point is, for me, links to the dominant children's rights discourse, how it emerged, and the implications it's had for how we understand childhood. And I think we recognize that this dominant children's rights discourse emerged from 19th century child-saving movements in Europe, North America, but also South America, although I would say that in South America it was limited to a certain group of children, not to all children. And this child-saving movement had as its central premise the idea that childhood was fundamentally distinct from adulthood. And this distinction was seen to be characterized by attributes associated with childhood, such as innocence, immaturity, purity, vulnerability, and incompetence. And these attributes created a situation whereby childhood became seen as a period that needed to be protected and cared for. And while this distinction ensured that new strategies were adopted to protect the status of childhood, it also resulted in this phase of life, childhood, becoming perceived as more inferior to adulthood, because its so-called inherent features also serve to indicate that this phase of life lacked something that adulthoods possess. So it was deficient from adulthood, which was used as the benchmark as to what full personhood was supposed to be about. And this consequently resulted in increasing the control over and the regulation of children by primarily so-called superior adults, most of whom were professionals, not necessarily the adults in their families, but the focus was trying to ensure the regulation of childhoods by professional adults. And by the end of the 19th century, in Europe and North and Latin America, these professionals were charged with governing new understandings of childhood that had emerged within these contexts and ensuring that it applied to all children or many children within their context. And again, I would say Latin America, as you all know more than me, is slightly different because I think the focus of the child-saving movement was on white children, not on other groups of children. And it's important to realize that this consolidation of this understanding of childhood that emerged from the child-saving movement was supported by institutions that were set up, such as the school, and also professions that emerged at that time, such as social workers and psychologists as well, and youth workers, etc. And it was due to these features that came to characterize the dominant construction of childhood in Western Europe and North America by the early 20th century that American scholar Bob Corbett, in his review of Philip Arias' Centuries of Childhood, made the point that societies in Western Europe and North America have nurtured children into childhood. He says, we like to think that children are children by nature, but actually it's a choice that these societies have made, and that we have made children into childhood, or we've turned children into childhood. And while the origins of these developments were initially quite specific to Western Europe and North America and to certain groups of children in Latin America, much of this new understanding of childhood that was being consolidated in the 19th century formed the basis of early children's rights discourses, which were launched onto a global platform by the 1924 Declaration on the Rights of the Child, which was adopted by the League of Nations. And in the 100 years since its adoption, we have to acknowledge that the concept of children's rights has expanded and it has evolved due to refinements that were made in the 1959 Declaration on the Rights of the Child and the 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as various optional protocols attached to the convention. And the 1989 Convention has been seen as especially transformative in conceptualizations of children's rights in international law and social policy, not only because it was the first binding treaty on human rights or on children's rights, but it was also the first to recognize children as rights holders, subjects, not objects of international law. So unlike the 1924 Declaration and the 1959 Declaration, no longer was children's rights framed as the inverted duties that benevolent adults offered to powerless and passive children. Instead, children's rights were now seen as claims that children could assert against adults, be they families, adults in their families, professionals, or the state. And this recognition of children as subjects of international law was instrumental in ensuring the inclusion of civil and political rights within the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this inclusion of civil and political rights was at the time seen as a groundbreaking act by those who drafted the convention, because it meant that the first binding treaty on children's rights, which ratifying governments were committed to realizing within their national boundaries, regardless of cultural, economic, political context, not only sought to make provisions for children's protection and provision rights, but it also granted them enabling rights, especially centered around the rights to freedom of expression and association. However, while the convention has been framed as a significant step change from previous children's rights declarations, there remains questions about the extent to which its provisions have been genuinely transformative in how children are perceived and treated in law and social policy, as well as in the behaviors and practices of organizations, groups, and individuals that work with children. Specifically, in the process of formulating the rights of children, the convention, like the 1924 Declaration and the 1959 Declaration, did not seek to include children themselves in the 10 years that it took to draft the convention. So no children were involved in articulating the rights that we all work with in one way or another. And so this has resulted in a situation whereby the rights of children, as currently articulated in all of the treaties and in the work of organizations and programs working with dominant children's rights discourses, are rights as they have been imagined by adults, professional adults, middle class adults, and not by children themselves. And most of these adults were based in Europe. So if you look at the drafting process, most of the governments that were able to participate in the 10 years were Europe and North American. I think Argentina was the only Latin American country that managed to have somebody at all the meetings in Geneva. I think India and maybe Central African Republic. But most of the governments that participated were from Europe and North America. So it's that vision, it's their vision of children's rights that we can see within the convention. In addition, although the convention is unique in its recognition of children possessing civil and political rights, these are limited to children having a say, specifically having a say on issues affecting their own lives, as opposed to issues affecting the wider community in which they live. Beyond this, it doesn't recognize the right of children to self-determination, which would include, for example, the right of children, the children's right to vote, for example. And the implication of these persistent questions about the Convention is that despite praise for its transformative potential, it continues to recognize childhood as a phase of life which is not only distinct from adulthood, but that is also inferior to adulthood. Consequently, it makes provision for childhood to be subjected to adult power and control, especially professional adult power and control. It further continues the process of seeking to regulate the space for children to enact agency and capability, resulting in the modification of civil and political rights when applied to the notion of children's rights, as opposed to the broader concept of human rights. In effect, what I'm saying is that what civil and political rights mean when we talk about children's rights is not the same as what they mean when we talk about human rights more generally. And what all of this means is that despite its inclusion of civil and political rights, the Convention has continued to facilitate the shrinking of the space for children to demonstrate agency unless that agency is regulated, managed, or controlled by adults, a process which, like I said earlier, has its roots in 19th century European and American child-saving movements. And the subjugation of children's expression of agency to adult control has led some scholars, Gallagher and Gallagher in particular, to assert that the very notion of empowerment implies that without aid and encouragement from adult-designed participatory methods, children cannot fully exercise their agency in research encounters. So there's this sense that for children to be able to enact agency, adults need to be involved. Adults need to support them, need to help them. And in fact, if we look back in history, we can see many instances of children enacting agency without any support from adults. But yet, what the Convention has now resulted in a situation that we all feel, and many children themselves also feel, that they need that support of adults in order for them to be able to express their agency. So it can be argued that through formal initiatives inspired by the Convention in the past 35 years or so, which aim to promote or facilitate the ability of children to participate or enact agency, strategies are actually being developed to regulate and control this group of people. And the consequence of this is the increased independence and reliance of children on adults, and the corresponding increase in the power that adults have over determining the extent to which and the ways in which children can express agency, especially in formal spheres. And this regulation and governance of children's lives is not only evident within global policy making or the work of international, national, or local child-focused children's rights organizations. This framing of the status of childhood and indeed the status of adulthood has additionally filtered into broader societal discourses around childhood in many contexts. And one area which has been impacted by children's rights discourses is institutional research ethics frameworks within many universities, which draw on the principle of do no harm to determine what is considered good quality research. And such frameworks and their attendant protocols, when applied to those under the age of 18, require special safeguards to be applied to research processes, as children, i.e. those under the age of 18, are automatically assumed to be both vulnerable and incompetent simply because of their age, their biological age. And this framing of childhood becomes problematic when undertaking research with children in contexts which have different understandings of what it means to be both a child and an adult. And as a result, they conceptualize competence in different ways. And David Archard in the past has argued that while in Western societies, adulthood is the goal, in other societies, it is a process. It is a continued becoming and never completed maturing. And I'm 45 years old now, and I have to say that I realize now, maybe I didn't realize it when I was a child because I couldn't wait to become 18. I thought something was going to be transformative. But I have realized that actually I am still growing all the time. I don't want to put, I can't tell you when it happens, but I feel like every time I'm becoming more and more of an adult, and I can't see that ever stopping. You become more and more of an adult, and sometimes I feel very childlike as well. And in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, that's where I do most of my research. So that's where I have been thinking, that's the context in which I've been thinking about many of these issues. And when we look historically, the organizing principle underpinning many societies was centered around interdependence between individuals. So if we look at the pre-colonial period in Africa, many African empires, they were very different. Some were patrilineal, some were matrilineal, some were based on more democratic principles, some were very hierarchical. But regardless of how they organized themselves, they were a key principle in all of these societies was interdependence between individuals. And this understanding of relationality was so critical that it formed the basis of concepts and values that informed the structures of these societies and also the social relationships of these societies. And the most obvious example of this notion of interdependence that you might know about is Ubuntu, which is a Bantu philosophical and religious concept that recognizes that the humanity of individuals is achieved through their social interaction with others, including those of different generations. And this led to a situation whereby notions of mutual aid, obligation, and support were foregrounded in social relationships. And amongst the Akan people of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, which are places in West Africa, Ghanaian philosopher Kwame Gyekye explains that social relations were constructed on the basis that behaviors relating to mutual aid, support, and obligation made up a morality of duty. And according to his argument, or according to this worldview, individuals are not self-sufficient. And as a result, they need assistance and the goodwill of others to fulfill their own basic needs and personal objectives. And these principles or values underpinning this worldview were expected to be evident in how individuals related to each other. So specifically, within this context, there was an understanding that individuals not only had duties towards each other, but they also possessed rights that they could claim from one another. And the implication of these principles for intergenerational relationships were that adults and children depended on each other to achieve their well-being and personal objectives, as well as broader household or family objectives. And these principles are not simply descriptions of social relationships in the past. We can still see these relationships and these expectations in worldviews in West Africa today. And I am from Ghana, and I can tell you that in relationships with my wider family, these expectations around mutuality, obligation, reciprocity are still very much expected in how people relate to each other. So in Ghana, the persistence of the notion of interdependence between adults and children manifests itself in the understanding in numerous communities in the country that both are expected to not only receive care from each other, but to also provide care to one another. And given the interdependency that characterizes the relationship between adults and children, and the emphasis that is placed on reciprocal obligations and the mutuality of duty between generations, I have argued in one of my articles that it may be more appropriate to discuss equally the dependency associated with both phases of life instead of primarily associating childhood with dependency. And this raises questions about the validity of the basis upon which we draw a linkage between the status of adulthood and the term caregiver. In my own research, I am now struggling to use the word caregiver and talk about adults, because I know that in the context that I work in Ghana and also in Nigeria, children also provide care, and they're expected to provide care. So it feels very strange for me to be talking about adults and using the word caregiver. So I don't know what other word I can use because a lot of children don't live with their parents. They live with other caregivers. But now I can't use that word, so I am stuck. So if anyone has any suggestions, please help me. So this understanding of intergenerational relations is, as a result, reflected in conceptualizations of childhood and children's roles within their society. In particular, this understanding of personhood and the attendant social relations that underpin it has resulted in understanding that childhood is a phase of life in which children are recognized as competent and capable, and therefore are able to undertake responsibilities which are increased incrementally as they become more mature and competent, which adults monitor in their daily interactions with children. And the work of German anthropologist Ines Schildkraut in the 1970s in northern Nigeria has been really helpful to me in thinking through some of these issues over the decades. And in her work in urban Kano in northern Nigeria, Schildkraut concluded that as children undertook responsibilities from an early age, many of which adults relied on so that they could undertake other tasks or adhere to religious or cultural practices, especially in the case of women, growing up in that context was not a case of children transitioning from being unproductive members of society to becoming productive members of society. And she argues that this is because as children, they were already productive members of society. And therefore, she really problematizes that binary we make between unproductive children and productive adults because it doesn't work in that context. So going back to the issue of institutional research ethics frameworks, the question then becomes, what happens when researchers try to apply ethics protocols which are premised on the understanding of the vulnerability, immaturity, incompetence of those who are under the age of 18 to contexts where childhood and indeed adulthood are thought about in different ways. In relation to informed consent, for example, while in some contexts research institutional frameworks require parental consent for the involvement of children under the age of 16, as well as assent from children themselves for those under the age of 16, this does not necessarily work very well within contexts where childhood is not automatically associated with incompetence, dependence, and immaturity. And this is something I have had to grapple with in my own research in Ghana and in England. And I want to talk about both just so that you can see that when we're talking about different understandings of childhood, which are at odds with children's rights, dominant children's rights discourses, it's not just in context in the global south where we see these variations. Even in the context in the global north, we can see cultures that are at odds with dominant rights discourses. And I think that's really important for us to highlight. So in relation to Ghana, a lot of my work has taken place in deprived communities in the capital city, Accra. And in the communities that I have worked in, these are communities that have been characterized for a long time by high levels of illiteracy and unemployment. One of the communities is additionally characterized by high levels of teenage pregnancy and single-parent families, where a lot of so-called caregivers struggle to care for their children. And this community is quite interesting because when you go there, it's full of women and children. There are not a lot of men in this community, and it's right in the heart of the financial district in Accra. So there are many children in this community who do not go to school because their parents cannot afford it, or they don't go to school on a regular basis because the parents don't have the money for the school fees. So when the parents don't have the money, they have to stay at home until money is found for them to go to school. And as a result of this background in this community, many children, even those as young as 12, have to look after themselves. Or they have to look for other people to take care of them. Now, they may still be living with their parents, but when they wake up in the morning until they go to sleep at night, they are looking after themselves. They are looking for money to buy food and whatever else they need. They are making decisions all day about how they want to spend the day and what they want to do for that day and how they're going to make money to eat. And this situation has implications for the authority many parents can claim over their children within this particular community. And one child said to me, parents do not talk to their children when they do something bad, because if a parent does not take care of their child, they cannot advise them. And this highlights the important role that reciprocity, which I've already mentioned, plays in social relations, including intergenerational relations in this context. So by failing to provide for their children's everyday necessities, especially in relation to school fees, some parents in this community lost some influence over their children because their children no longer felt the need to listen to or take on board what the parents had to say, even though they were living in the same house. And the implication for my own research was that as I sought to obtain informed consent from parents and other guardians, I suppose, in order for children to participate in my study, I was advised by a community member who had helped me to gain access to the community that there was no point in obtaining parental consent for such groups. And he explained that this was because for these children, whether or not their parents or caregivers consented to their participation didn't mean anything. It meant little to them because they made their own decisions every day about what they wanted to do. So getting parental consent and then also the children's assent didn't mean anything. And he recommended that I just forget about parental consent and just focus on getting the consent of the children directly. And this is something I was able eventually to do after discussions. I was in the field. This was for my PhD, so I was a very new researcher, and I had to get the help of my supervisors to talk to the ethics committee at my university in England. And it took some time, but eventually it was agreed that I could do that. And this experience I have had in the field in Ghana is supported by other Ghanaian academics, Yao Ofosukusi and Samuel Otri. I'm not going to read the points because I feel like I'm running out of time, but I'll just give you a second to just have a look at their argument here. And I think it's really important to highlight that this is not specific to Africa or to West Africa. And in fact, these are issues that researchers are grappling with in other contexts as well. And Jessica Taft, who's done a lot, sorry, somebody's taking a picture. Do you want to finish taking a picture? Jessica Taft, who does most of her work in Latin America, has recently talked about what some of these issues mean for her own research in Latin America. And this was in a recent roundtable discussion for the 30th anniversary of the journal Childhood. Again, I'm not going to read it, and maybe I'll put my head down and people can you can take a picture. Okay. So, and it's also important to underscore that these issues are not just relevant to the South. It's not just an issue of Latin America and Africa and Asia. These are issues in the global North as well. And this became evident to me recently when I did some work, some non-academic work actually, with a London local authority on Gypsy, Roma and traveller children. And I'll come back to that in a minute actually. And the findings from that particular study, which was about children's access and experience of school-based education, really hammered home to me how there are communities in the global North that are also in very similar ways struggling with these issues, because they also have, they place an emphasis on childhood competence at an early age. And in the Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities, there is an understanding that a lot of their culture has been changing due to enormous social changes that have been taking place in the UK, for example. But there's still an understanding that the traditional values that they have been transmitting for generations continue to be important in the way they live their lives. And examples of these traditional values are early responsibility or childhood responsibility. And this is seen to help equip children with the skills and the behaviors that they believe children need when they become adults. And the other key value that they emphasize still in their socialization is strict gender socialization, about what boys can do and how boys should behave, and what girls can do and how girls can behave. And these persistent values had an impact on children's experiences of the formal education system, because in the UK, one of the things that we see is that Gypsy, Roma and traveller children are the most at risk of dropping out of school. A lot of them no longer continue from primary school to high school. They kind of leave school after primary school. Primary schools are very small, so the parents feel like that's okay. But secondary schools are huge, and the parents don't like that. And they also don't like their girls mixing with boys in secondary school. So you find that at the age of 11, a lot of them go for homeschooling, which is maybe like a tutor once a week who comes to do English and maths. Some of them, they don't even do that. So, but these issues don't just affect the formal education sector, they affect other areas. And it affected us in our own research with this group. And I think we noticed it in particular with the Irish traveller groups and also what we call English Gypsy groups. And I think it's really important for me to highlight that these are British people. They're not, when we talk about Roma, we think about recent migrants, Eastern European migrants that have come to the UK or other parts of Western Europe. I am talking about English Gypsies who first arrived in England in 1505 as part of the Gypsy migration from India. That started like about 1,000 years ago. But these people are British in all intents and purposes. They're not foreigners. And I think it's really important to highlight that when talking about how they understand competence and in childhood. And it's what we found in our research was that the socialization process, which centered around early responsibility and strict gender norms, had an impact on our ability to engage with teenage boys in particular. And for this group of children, the socialization process in many families foregrounded the freedom that boys had, with some of the female participants in the study talking about how boys are the boss. They're the boss. They have free will to do what they want at home. And one 16-year-old participant talked about her nephew in trying to explain why he struggled in school and why he had eventually been kicked out of school. He said, he doesn't want to go to school because he's different at home. At school, he has to sit, he can't move, but at home, he's free. He can do whatever he wants. And this idea of boys being free and being the boss at home had an impact on our study, because most of the people we were able to access were mostly women and girls. And so we struggled to access men. Even though we went to football clubs and tried to recruit from there, we couldn't get many men from English gypsy communities in our study. So we were trying to recruit children through women. And what this meant was that we didn't get many teenage boys, because the consent of their mothers didn't mean anything to these boys, because they do what they want. They are the boss. They have free will. And therefore, their mothers agreeing for them to take part in the study didn't mean that they would even consider taking part in the study. So what we ended up with were women, teenage girls, and some younger boys. Okay. And this point about mothers not having an impact on whether older teenage boys from English, Gypsy, or Irish traveller communities participated in the study had consequences for, or raises other issues in terms of adults giving consent for children to participate, because in some communities, the gender dynamics that exist mean that a 15-year-old boy may be recognized as being more capable and having more authority to give his own informed assent for his participation and that of a younger child than an adult woman. And this was something that this experience with Gypsy Roma traveller communities got me to think about, because an adult woman and mother, a mother's consent didn't mean anything for a teenage boy about whether they wanted to participate in the study. So the question that this left for me is, how do we move towards a more meaningful ethics practice that moves beyond procedural ethics and takes into consideration the needs and wishes of real children and their families in relation to informed consent and the different ways they understand or conceptualize childhood competence in their context? And for me, I cannot see how this can be done without the adoption of a collaborative approach by ethics committees with different groups of children to determine what they themselves find meaningful in relation to the concept of the do no harm principle that underpins much of the research ethics framework when it comes to consent processes. And so the questions for me is, what was such a collaborative research ethics framework which has been co-produced with children look like? What would it foreground? What can it offer us in relation to how we do research with adults as well? And what does the outcome of this conversation or this collaboration with children look like, depending on the identities of the children involved, bearing in mind gender, variables, race, disability, sexual orientation, geographical location, both within national boundaries and across context. And the example focusing on children in Ghana and in Gypsy Roma traveller communities in the UK, both of whom live in contexts where their competence is recognised at an early age, at least in relation to consent processes, reinforce the point that not only that only a collaborative approach with children can reveal the everyday and relational ethical principles that they value and foreground in relationships with adults and others. And I think if I had realized this earlier on in my early research with children in Ghana, I think this would have prevented me from initially alienating some of the children that I was trying to get into my study. And I would argue that actually in some ways I did do harm to those children by initially insisting on trying to get parental consent before talking to them. So even though I was following my university's ethics processes, which are about doing no harm, I feel when I think about it that I did do some harm initially. In relation to the project I was involved in with Gypsy, Roma and Traveller children, our ability to primarily access women from Irish Traveller and English Gypsy communities meant that we were not able to directly access the voices and experiences of teenage boys. And this led to a situation whereby, while we got lots of interesting data about the experiences and the challenges that older boys especially experience in the school system, both academically and socially, these were gathered through the narratives of their mothers and sometimes their sisters or cousins. And what we lost was the direct accounts of the experiences and perspectives and all the nuances that goes with those accounts of older boys whose schooling trajectories were established during the research we did as being fraught with enormous and sometimes insurmountable obstacles in relation to their academic progress, social relationships with peers, teachers, and school management. So this inclusion of children in the development of research ethics frameworks is important, as a number of scholars have pointed out that what children may determine as harmful or ethically sound may be different from what has been envisioned and put in place. And we also have to acknowledge that different groups of children will emphasize different things when talking about what is ethically sound. And one example that I found quite interesting is the narrative or the argument put forward by human geographer Tracy Skelton, who talks about her own experience or her own childhood memory of participating in a research study undertaken by a trainee teacher in the 1970s when she was a 10-year-old girl attending a very small school in an English village. And I don't know if you can read it. I was like, yes. So try and see if you can quickly. Okay. So it's a very interesting example. Maybe read the article or something like that. But this extract is based on one child's experience, and I'm sure even though she was at a small school, the experiences or the accounts of other children might be quite different. But I still think that it offers us some interesting things that we can take away in terms of what some children might think of as being useful in terms of doing ethical research with them. I think it's important to highlight that some of the things that Skelton talks about, they're not things that could happen now, because things have changed so much since the 1970s. But one of the things that she talks about was how she felt safe within the context of the school, but also within the relationship with that teacher. And this is why she wanted to take part in the study. She also highlights the importance of the value of reciprocity in relationships between children and researchers. And she talked about how she wanted to give something back to a teacher that had done so much for her. And this is something that other researchers, such as Tata Kabebe, who works on Ethiopia, has also talked about, the importance of reciprocity in research relationships with children in the context in which he works. And she also talks about how if we read the example, we also see how she felt competent to make a decision about taking part in the research, because her parents were not consulted. She was asked. She asked some questions, and then they did the research. And so I think what really comes out is that her reflection, so that the consent process and her view that she felt competent to make the decision at that age of 10 to consent in research in the absence of any process which involved her parents indicates the extent to which gaining an understanding about what is safe and ethical in child research or any kind of interaction with children, not just research, cannot be achieved without direct engagement or dialogue with different groups of children. And I think maybe the last point I will make is that this collaboration or this dialogue or work with children to understand what is meaningful ethics, it's not just about involving children. It's about involving adults who have an impact in their daily lives, because the ethics processes that we all work with have been set up in the aftermath of World War II, and these were set up by middle-class professionals. But if we look at the children, especially in marginalized communities, not only do we need to ensure that the ethics processes that they engage with are meaningful to their lives, we also need to bear in mind that their parents, their adults, have also been marginalized from those processes, and we need to take steps to work with them and make sure that the processes that we come up with are also meaningful to them in research about themselves and also about their children. So I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Afua, por esta increíble presentación que, teniendo quizás sobre el terreno que pareciera tan lejano, seguro que a nosotros, a varios, nos resuena en tantos aspectos. Vamos a dar un ratito para preguntas. ¿Dani? Ok. La manera en la que vamos a trabajar es que las pueden enviar a través de ese código que aparece ahí, y no vamos a responder todas las preguntas, pero vamos a tratar de articular un par de temáticas. Ok, esto es la primera vez que me toca interactuar así con este sistema. Entonces, las voy a leer. ¿Ya? La primera dice: ¿cuándo hizo la investigación y qué edad tenían los adolescentes entrevistados? La segunda dice: la Universidad Británica aceptó el relativismo cultural de aceptar que niños trabajadores den su consentimiento. ¿El financiamiento de dónde venía?
The example in Ghana that I was talking about, it was the children were aged between about 10 and 17, 18. So, yeah. When? This was for my PhD, so this was my PhD research in 2005. Yeah.
Okay, the second question, I'm going to tell them to you, is asking whether the university you were doing your research with accepted or not that cultural relativism about these working children and them giving their consent, and where was the funding coming from in that research?
Okay. So this was a PhD research funded by the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, and I'm not sure if I can say the university accepted cultural relativism. I don't consider myself a cultural relativist either, but when I encountered the issue in the field and I explained the situation, as a new researcher, the first thing I did was talk to my supervisors about it. And then we worked with the ethics committees to try and get them to understand that particular community. And it did take some time, but eventually I was able to amend my ethics consent forms, my ethical forms. And I think one of the things that I wanted to point out in my presentation, but I skipped that bit, was that we do need to consider that with ethics committees, when we're talking about the rigid nature of ethics committees, this varies a lot from institution to institution, and that actually sometimes it's about, there are some individuals within ethics committees who are willing to be flexible and who have some understanding. So we can talk about the rigid nature of university institutional ethics processes, but this can sometimes really depend on who is on that committee. And so I think I was very fortunate, and I had my supervisors were both anthropologists, one who had worked in Ghana for many years, and the other one who had worked in Nigeria for many years. So I think I had the support of people who really understood what I was grappling with and were able to advocate for me in trying to, with the ethics committee.
I think another way of wrapping up some of the questions is the one asking for whether you could identify a starting age of self-consent in children of different communities. And this person puts an example of the age for the younger, for example, from 1 to 5 years old. And maybe we could discuss the one over here that talks about progressive autonomy as a concept at the time of talking about children's independence, and what do you make of that concept?
So in terms of the starting age, I don't work with very young children, but I do think that in the community that I'm working it with, you do see very young children taking care of themselves. I think not 1 or 2 or anything like that, but certainly I would think that from the age of 7 about, you see that children are given a lot of leeway, and they take a lot of leeway. I was saying to Marjorie the other day that there's some anthropological research relating to West Africa that shows that from the age of 7, children are seen as having sense. So at that age, there's this sharp shift, I suppose, in understanding that they should have responsibilities. So even though I don't work with such a young group, I would think that from 7, it is very possible that that's when children are seen as having competence, because it's at that age that it's believed that, or historically, traditionally, or whatever, it's believed that they have sense, and that having sense leads to parents changing the way they raise their children, giving them more responsibilities, expecting more from them at that time. I don't know if I understand the. Can you just read it as it's written? The other one.
Habría que subir la que era de autonomía progresiva. Más arriba. Más arriba. Es la de aquí a la izquierda. La autonomía progresiva es un concepto central a la hora de hablar de independencia. ¿Cómo entiendes tú esa idea?
Oh.
Right. La autonomía progresiva es un concepto central a la hora de hablar de independencia. ¿Cómo entiendes tú esa idea?
I mean, I think in the context in which I work, it's about, I would say, I would go back to this understanding that when the communities are talking about the responsibilities of children, they don't just give children responsibilities and say, right, here you go. They start off incrementally. Okay, so if it's about fetching water from the river or something, you start off with a small, pail of water. And as you're able to do it more, they'll give you like a bucket. And then you're able to do what you want. So in terms of responsibilities, we see that. And you have communities, families who are monitoring children to decide, oh, you're able to do that? Now you have to do more. Now you have to do more until you're able to do what adults can do. And I would say that with competence, the question is about competence, right? Or autonomy and independence. I would say it's a bit similar. I think that parents are watching how competent, how mature children are able to do from the task that they give them. And then they increase or the expectation around competence, around autonomy. I think we need to be careful with those words, autonomy and independence, because these are very collectivist societies. And independence is not really encouraged. Instead, people are trying to encourage interdependence. They want people to continue working with helping each other, the collectivist principles. So I know that being completely independent is something that even today is still frowned upon. You know, in my own family, when I was growing up, I'm very independent. I didn't want to do things, and my parents would always like criticize me for not being, for being too independent. Like, you have to be interdependent, you have to be sociable, you have to do your responsibilities to others so that they will also do for you. So I think the term, and I think that those terms, autonomy and independence, I'm not saying that they're not recognized in those contexts, but I just think that they can only be taken so far, because it's interdependence and collectivity. Those are the principles that I would say are still foregrounded within the context. And I think being too interdependent is a bit, it worries people, I would say. Yeah.
Vamos a terminar con un par de últimas preguntas. Hay una que dice, ¿hay un trabajo ético antes de coproducir marcos éticos con los niños? ¿Y qué herramientas recomendarías para construir un diálogo directo?
I'm really sorry, Marjorie. Can you start again? Because I missed the beginning of that.
¿Hay un trabajo ético antes de coproducir marcos éticos con los niños? ¿Y qué herramientas recomendarías para construir un diálogo directo?
Okay.
Does it make any sense?
They mean with ethics committees doing work with children?
It doesn't mention ethics committees. It asks whether, like, what is the kind of ethical work you would do before the co-producing with friends with the children?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think it's. I think a lot of it is about. First of all, I would say that what needs to be done is work with ethics committees. I think there's a lot of advocacy work and a lot of preparation work or training, I suppose, maybe, with ethics committees. I would actually start with ethics committees, not with children, to help them understand what we know as childhood researchers, the struggles we all have, I'm sure, when we go and work, especially in marginalized communities. So I would actually start with ethics committees, engage with them, show them some of the work that's been done, some of the difficulties, bring researchers to them, and to have a dialogue with ethics committees. Then I think with the children, I think that, you know, I would say participatory research methodologies would be a good way to ask them, like, how do they think about ethics? How do they think about doing no harm in research? What kind of principles would they like to see when we as adults come and interact with them for research or any other purpose? What do they find meaningful? What don't they find meaningful? And I would use participatory research. And it would be really important to do this research with different groups of children, because we can't assume that they're all going to say the same thing. And I think then at some point we'd have to share these the outcome of these discussions with children back with university ethics committees. I don't see it as a short-term process. I think it can take a long time, and I do foresee that there will be quite a bit of resistance, not just from ethics committees, but other academics who are going to be worried about what this might mean in terms of safeguarding vulnerable children.
Muchísimas gracias a la doctora Afua. Vamos a darle un aplauso y vamos